Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Storyline English. Today, I want to tell you a story about a man who spent 27 years in prison, but never gave up hope. A man who could have chosen revenge, but chose forgiveness instead. His name was Nelson Mandela, and his story changed not just one country, but inspired the whole world. If you enjoy stories like this, stories that help you improve your English while learning about real heroes, please subscribe to this channel. Now, let me take you back to South Africa, to a time when the color of your skin decided your entire life. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small village called Mvezo in South Africa. His birth name was Rolihlahla, which means troublemaker in his language. And perhaps that name was right, because Nelson would spend his whole life making trouble for injustice. He grew up in the beautiful hills of the Eastern Cape. His father was a chief, a leader in their community. Young Nelson lived a simple life. He played with other children. He looked after cattle. He listened to the elders tell stories around the fire at night. These stories were about African heroes, about brave warriors, about leaders who fought for their people. When Nelson was 9 years old, his father died. This changed everything. A man named Jongintaba, the acting king of the Tembu people, became his guardian. Nelson went to live in the royal household. There, he saw how leaders made decisions. He watched them listen to everyone before they spoke. He learned that a good leader serves the people, not himself. Nelson went to school. He was a good student. He loved learning. At school, a teacher gave him an English name, Nelson. In those days, African children were often given English names at school. It was part of the system that said European ways were better than African ways. But Nelson was curious. He asked questions. He read books. He wanted to understand the world. And slowly, he began to see that something was very wrong in his country. He saw that white people had power, land, and freedom. But black people, who were the majority, had almost nothing. They could not vote. They could not live where they wanted. They could not even walk on certain streets. This was called apartheid. The word means apartness in Afrikaans, one of the languages in South Africa. Apartheid was a system of laws that separated people by race. It gave all the power to white people and took away the rights of black people, colored people, and Indian people. Nelson went to university. He studied at Fort Hare, the only university for black students in South Africa at that time. There, he met other young people who also questioned the system. They talked about freedom. They talked about equality. They talked about change. But Nelson was expelled from university because he joined a student protest. He returned to the royal household, but Jongintaba wanted him to get married to a woman chosen for him. Nelson did not want this. So he made a brave decision. He ran away to Johannesburg, the biggest city in South Africa. In Johannesburg, everything was different. The city was huge, noisy, and full of energy. But it was also full of injustice. Nelson saw the apartheid system more clearly than ever. He worked different jobs. He finished his university degree by correspondence. Then he began to study law. And this is where Nelson Mandela's real journey began. Because in Johannesburg, he met people who were not just talking about change. They were working for it. They were fighting for it. And Nelson decided to join them. In 1944, when Nelson was 26 years old, he joined the African National Congress, or ANC. This was an organization that fought for the rights of black South Africans. But at that time, the ANC was quite gentle. They wrote letters, they made petitions, they asked the government politely for change. Nelson and some other young members thought this was not enough. They formed the ANC Youth League. They wanted action, not just words. They organized protests, strikes, and campaigns. They wanted to put pressure on the government. Nelson became a lawyer. He opened a law firm with his friend Oliver Tambo. They helped black people who were arrested under apartheid laws. Every day, Nelson saw how the system destroyed people's lives. People were arrested for not carrying the right papers. Families were separated. Communities were destroyed when the government decided that black people could not live in certain areas. In 1948, the situation became worse. A new government came to power. They made apartheid even stronger. They created more laws to separate people. They banned marriages between different races. They created separate schools, separate hospitals, separate beaches, separate entrances to buildings. Everything was separate, and everything for black people was worse. Nelson and the ANC fought back. In 1952, they launched the Defiance Campaign. This was a campaign of non-violent resistance. Thousands of people deliberately broke apartheid laws. They went to whites-only areas. They refused to carry their passes, the documents that black people had to carry everywhere. They were arrested, but they did not fight back with violence. Nelson traveled all over the country, organizing people, giving speeches, inspiring hope. He became famous. People called him a hero, but the government called him a troublemaker. They banned him from attending meetings. They restricted where he could go. But Nelson did not stop. He could not stop, because he had seen too much suffering. He had seen mothers crying because their children were taken away. He had seen men beaten by police for walking on the wrong street. He had seen dignity crushed and hope destroyed. In 1955, the ANC and other organizations created the Freedom Charter. This was a document that described their vision for South Africa. It began with powerful words. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. The Freedom Charter said that everyone should have the right to vote. Everyone should have equal rights. The land and resources should be shared. The government's response was harsh. In 1956, they arrested 156 activists, including Nelson Mandela. They were charged with treason, which means trying to overthrow the government. The trial lasted 5 years. 5 years of uncertainty. 5 years of pressure. But in the end, all the accused were found not guilty. However, during these years, something terrible happened. In 1960, in a place called Sharpeville, police opened fire on peaceful protesters. They killed 69 people, including women and children. This massacre shocked the world. It also changed Nelson Mandela's thinking. For years, Nelson and the ANC had believed in non-violent resistance. They had followed the example of Mahatma Gandhi. But now, Nelson believed that non-violence alone would not work. The government only understood force. So, in 1961, Nelson helped create Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of the Nation. This was the armed wing of the ANC. They began to sabotage government buildings and infrastructure. They were careful not to hurt people, only to damage property. They wanted to send a message: we will fight back. Nelson knew this was dangerous. He knew he could be arrested. He knew he could be killed. But he felt he had no choice. He said later, "We chose to start a fight against violence, to use controlled violence against the government's violence." Nelson went underground. He moved secretly from place to place. He wore disguises. People called him the Black Pimpernel because he was so hard to catch. He even left the country secretly to get military training and to ask other African countries for support. But in 1962, after 17 months underground, Nelson was arrested. Someone had betrayed him. He was charged and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Then, in 1963, while he was already in prison, police raided the secret headquarters of Umkhonto we Sizwe. They found documents, plans, and evidence. Nelson and 7 other leaders were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The punishment could be death. The trial was called the Rivonia trial, named after the place where the leaders were arrested. It became one of the most famous trials in history. The world was watching. Would these men be sentenced to death? Nelson Mandela decided to speak in court. On April 20th, 1964, he gave a speech that lasted more than 4 hours. He explained why they had chosen to fight. He explained the suffering of black people under apartheid. He talked about freedom, dignity, and justice. He ended his speech with these words: "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The courtroom was silent. The world listened. And many people expected that Nelson and the others would be sentenced to death. But they were not. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. On June 13, 1964, Nelson Mandela was taken to Robben Island, a prison on a small island off the coast of Cape Town. This would be his home for the next 18 years. Robben Island was a harsh place. The prisoners slept on thin mats on the concrete floor. They had one blanket. The food was poor. Black prisoners received even less food than colored prisoners. This was apartheid, even in prison. Every day the prisoners were taken to a limestone quarry. There, they had to break rocks with hammers and dig lime. The work was hard. The sun was bright, and the white lime reflected the light into their eyes. Many prisoners, including Nelson, damaged their eyesight permanently because of this work. But Nelson Mandela did not break. He refused to be broken. He turned the prison into a place of learning. He studied.
He encouraged other prisoners to study. Robben Island became known as Mandela University because so many men learned and grew there. Nelson was calm and dignified. He was respectful, even to the prison guards. He learned Afrikaans, the language of the oppressors, because he believed you must understand your enemy. He spoke to the guards as human beings, and slowly, over the years, some of them began to respect him. Some even began to question apartheid. The authorities tried to break his spirit. They offered him freedom if he would renounce violence. But Nelson always refused. He said he would only accept freedom when all his people were free. Years passed. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. The world did not forget Nelson Mandela. Around the world, people protested. They demanded his release. They sang songs about him. Artists refused to perform in South Africa. Countries imposed sanctions. Free Nelson Mandela became a global movement. Inside prison, Nelson held on to hope. He was allowed few visitors. He could write and receive only 1 letter every 6 months. Each letter could be only 500 words. He was allowed 1 visitor every 6 months for 30 minutes. Imagine that. 30 minutes with your family, once every 6 months, for 18 years. His wife, Winnie Mandela, was also harassed, arrested, and tortured by the government. His mother died, and he was not allowed to attend her funeral. His eldest son died in a car accident, and again, he was not allowed to go to the funeral. The pain was enormous. But still, Nelson did not give up. He exercised every morning in his cell. He read books. He thought about the future. He thought about the South Africa he wanted to build. And he made a decision. When he was free, he would not seek revenge. He would seek reconciliation. In 1982, after 18 years on Robben Island, Nelson was transferred to Pollsmoor prison on the mainland. Conditions were slightly better. In 1988, he was moved again to Victor Verster prison. There, he had a house in the prison grounds. The government was preparing, slowly, for his release. Because by the late 1980s, apartheid was dying. The economy was struggling because of international sanctions. There were protests and violence inside South Africa every day. The government realized they could not continue. They needed to negotiate. And they needed to negotiate with Nelson Mandela. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became the president of South Africa. He knew change had to come. He began secret meetings with Nelson Mandela. They talked about the future. They talked about how to avoid a civil war. They talked about how to transition to democracy. And finally, on February 11th, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free.
The world watched as Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison. He was 71 years old. He had spent 27 years, almost half his adult life, in prison. But he walked out with his head high, his fist raised, and a smile on his face. Thousands of people were waiting. They cheered, they cried, they sang. Nelson raised his fist and greeted them. He had not seen a crowd like this for almost 3 decades. The world had changed so much. But his mission had not changed. In his first speech as a free man, Nelson made his position clear. He thanked everyone who had fought for his release, but he said the struggle was not over. He said he was a servant of the people, and he would continue to work for freedom until every South African had equal rights. The next 4 years were difficult and dangerous. Nelson and President de Klerk negotiated the end of apartheid. But not everyone wanted peace. Some white extremists wanted to keep apartheid. Some black activists did not trust the negotiations. There was violence. People died. There were massacres. It seemed, sometimes, that South Africa would fall into civil war. But Nelson Mandela kept working for peace. He traveled across the country. He spoke to communities. He calmed tensions. He persuaded people to give peace a chance. He even reached out to his former enemies. He had tea with the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid. He visited the prosecutor who had tried to get him sentenced to death. He showed forgiveness. This was extraordinary. People expected Nelson to be angry. They expected him to want revenge. But Nelson understood something important. He understood that revenge would destroy the country. He said, "If you want to make peace with your enemy, you have to work with your enemy. Then he becomes your partner." In 1993, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize together. They had worked together to dismantle apartheid peacefully. The apartheid laws were abolished. All South Africans, regardless of race, would have the right to vote. And then came the historic day. April 27th, 1994. For the first time in South African history, everyone could vote. Black people, who were the majority, stood in long lines. Some waited for hours. Many were voting for the first time in their lives. Old people, who had lived their whole lives under oppression, cast their votes with tears in their eyes. It was a peaceful election. The ANC won. And on May 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. In his inauguration speech, he said, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." President Mandela faced enormous challenges. South Africa was divided. There was poverty, inequality, and trauma from decades of apartheid. How do you heal a nation? How do you build unity when people have so much pain? Nelson created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This was a special court where victims of apartheid could tell their stories and perpetrators could confess their crimes. If they told the truth, they could receive amnesty. The goal was not punishment, but truth and healing. It was painful. People heard terrible stories of torture, murder, and suffering. But slowly, the process helped the nation to heal. It was not perfect. Some people felt justice was not served, but it prevented a cycle of revenge and violence. Nelson Mandela served one term as president, from 1994 to 1999. He could have stayed longer. People loved him. But he chose to step down. He wanted to show that democracy was about institutions, not individuals. He wanted to set an example of peaceful transfer of power. After his presidency, Nelson continued to work for peace and justice around the world. He spoke out against HIV/AIDS, which was killing millions in Africa. He worked to promote education for children. He used his fame to raise money for good causes. He became a global symbol of forgiveness, reconciliation, and human dignity. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95. The whole world mourned. Presidents, kings, and ordinary people paid tribute to him. He was buried in his childhood village where his journey had begun, but his legacy lives on. Nelson Mandela showed the world that one person can make a difference. He showed that you can fight for justice without losing your humanity. He showed that forgiveness is not weakness, but strength. He showed that hope is more powerful than hate. His life was not easy. He suffered greatly. He made sacrifices that most of us cannot imagine. But he never gave up. He never stopped believing in a better future. And because of him, South Africa changed. Because of him, millions of people live in freedom today. Nelson Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." His life proved these words. The impossible became possible because one man, and many people with him, refused to accept injustice. So, my friends, this is the story of Nelson Mandela, a boy from a small village who became a freedom fighter, spent 27 years in prison, and then became president of his nation. A man who chose forgiveness over revenge and changed the world. I hope this story inspired you and helped you improve your English. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a like and subscribe to Storyline English for more stories like this. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, which part of Nelson Mandela's story inspired you the most? Or you can simply write one word that describes how this story made you feel. Thank you for listening, my friends. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep believing that change is possible.